My time's expired. I yield back.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Babin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. Stein, I love the example that you use of how government funding for NASA's solar space application led to the solar technologies that are now being applied to electricity generation. As the ranking member of the Space Subcommittee, I think that NASA is one of our most valuable research entities, so I want to thank you for recognizing that. But I think you're right when you say that we should only be funding research to create the foundation of new technologies, not using tax dollars for the whole life cycle of commercialization. Is there a different area of solar or wind, something revolutionary or market-changing that would be a better recipient of our limited federal monies for research?
Well, one example, I mentioned it briefly, and Dr. Green also, I think, mentioned it, is research into perovskite materials in solar cells. Right. These are new materials that aren't currently used in solar cells, and they have shown a lot of promise for being very efficient, using less resources per watt developed. So
yes.
I think that's a perfect example of, and that's something that NREL is already doing. But my point also is that once you've got that foundation, that discovery, the actual application, finding where it works best, what sort of applications, that's really should be the private sector role rather than NREL.
I got you. Another thing that I thought was intriguing when you said, and I agree with you, when you said that federal support should not go to projects that private interests have already got a clear incentive to develop. Can you give an example of a time that EERE or another program has used federal funds to develop something that very easily could have been done by the private sector with no cost to the American taxpayer, I might add? Supporters of the Green New Deal want us to completely cut the power on our current energy grid and transition to 100% renewables over the next several years, and I see that being detrimental to our economy. And can you explain how a more targeted plan to invest federal money in early-stage clean energy research followed by private sector development and deployment could better maintain our economic growth and lessen the burden of our working class? I know that was two questions that I asked. The first one, of course, answer the primary answer I wish you would give first.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, the famous example goes back to the stimulus and some of the money that was wasted on that. Obviously, Solyndra is the famous example,
right,
where you had a private company that already had a manufacturing technique that they were trying to develop, and the federal government basically wrote them a blank check. The problem is that they weren't really ready for prime time, and that's part of why we're struggling to get private funding in the private market. So I think that's an example of when you look at the SEIA. She earlier mentioned that it's a lot of these smaller businesses, that the solar industry, but the large utilities are also making these investments. There's other parts of the private sector that are making investments into rolling out. They've made a lot of commitments for certain percentages to come from renewables in the future, that sort of thing. And those are private sector commitments, and some of those are driven by state-level governments. But the point being is that that's a private groundswell, both consumer demand and regulatory demand.
Right.
It's not the federal government setting those benchmarks and trying to force the private sector to meet them.
Okay.